Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Lewis Cypher, and this is the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. Welcome back. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the coronavirus situation, our fears, and how we do and should handle them. First, I'd like to start off with a quote from Frank Herbert's classic Dune novels. "I must not fear, for fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration." And that's something that I think is very important to think about right now, because it is exactly what we are seeing with the coronavirus situation. Now, there are two main types of fear that people tend to talk about. Rational fears that, make sense and come from points of logic, and irrational fears. Now, irrational fears do not mean being afraid of something that there is no reason to be afraid of. You can have an irrational fear of something that there are plenty of reasons to be afraid of. For instance, my irrational fear is of sharp spinning blades, especially chainsaws. It's not that there aren't reasons to fear being maimed or killed by these. However, my fear of them goes beyond that, to a point that is irrational and is not similarly applied to other dangerous objects. So, when it comes to the coronavirus, first I'd like to establish whether we're talking about a rational or an irrational fear. Let's start by talking about the reasons that we have to be afraid. First of all, going back to the beginning, we didn't know a lot about the coronavirus. We knew about initially a series of ammonia cases in Wuhan, which we then found out to be a human communicable disease. So the first thing that we really found out about this virus that, brought it into our attention was that it was human-to-human transmissible. Now, this also means that we had been lied to, which means immediately there's a reason to think that they might be hiding more. I mean, why lie about human-to-human transmission if it's not some big deal? And as time continued, we heard more lies, as well as lots and lots of estimates which ended up just being absolutely wrong. Another reason we had to fear the virus is that near the wet market where it may not have originated from, but at least spread and grew into the problem that it became, near that wet market is a biolab that works on communicable diseases. So the idea that this disease could have been, created or modified in a lab is, well, absolutely terrifying. And the idea that it came from that lab is not laughable at all. In fact, it is quite likely that it originated from the lab. However, this isn't nearly the reason to be afraid that most people think it is. Jumping back to the topic of fear for a moment, fear is an adrenaline rush. It is addictive to many, if not most people. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone goes out of their way to be afraid, but there's something about that thrill of being alive that comes from the more primal emotions, fear being probably the easiest to go out of your way to experience, which really puts a jump in your day. And that's why media stories that, scare people, that call up the greatest emotional tribulations are the ones that get the most clicks, that get the most views. And given that media is monetized and their advertisements, they kind of have to pay attention to these kinds of things. So the media has a reason to frame things in a way that is as scary as possible because, that's going to incite a reaction from their audience, and it's exactly what we saw with the virus situation. we saw media across the globe, and I mean, I noticed it especially in America because that's where I live, but I have seen some foreign media as well that basically did everything it could to focus on the negatives of this virus, talking about the death rates for the elderly and the infirm, while not saying much about the overall death rates. Part of that was because we didn't really have great numbers until recently. So, continuing on with whether or not this is irrational as a fear, what exactly are those numbers? The death toll as it sits now, there have been different studies, and it does vary, sits right around 0.02%. Now, when I initially was doing research into this virus, there were claims that the death toll was going to be somewhere around 10%, which I'll admit, when I first heard, scared me. A disease that is more communicable than the flu, with a death toll of 10%, would be absolutely staggering. It would be apocalyptic for many countries. It probably would have been for Italy, as the death toll would have been much higher there. Let's stop and talk about that for just a moment. Why did Italy have such a high death toll? Well, two very, very simple reasons. They had about the oldest population of any country in the world. In fact, I believe they did, up until this virus, have the oldest population of any country in the world. And they are a touchy-feely folk. They hug and kiss to say hello a lot more than other cultures, which, in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with until there is a communicable disease. But anyway, they had every reason for the disease to spread there in ways that it simply would not be expected to in other countries. But the death rates were probably expanded anyway, as lots of people who die are being coded as coronavirus, even if they have other conditions that may have been the real cause of their deaths. In many cases, hospitals are actually getting more money for coronavirus deaths than they do for other patients who die there, so it's in their best good old capitalist interests to mark them down as coronavirus every chance that they get. In New York, for instance, in one day, there were 3,000 people marked down as coronavirus deaths who had not, in fact, tested positive of the virus. It is impossible to know, given that different countries handle their recording in different ways, exactly how many of the people who have been recorded as coronavirus deaths were not tested for the virus and may not have, in fact, had it. But it is a bit higher than zero, let's just put it that way. Even taking these potentially inflated numbers into account, the coronavirus is about as bad as a particularly bad year of the flu. Now, don't get me wrong, it spreads a little bit faster and, more than the flu, and it does kill a little bit more people than the flu, maybe even twice as many people as the flu does on an average year. But that's an average year. We had a flu season just a couple of years ago that may very well end up comparing quite well to this coronavirus. So, while COVID-19 is certainly something that's not to be sneered at, as those deaths are in addition to the deaths that are normally there by the flu season, and while it wasn't necessarily the death rate, but the hospitalization rate that initially scared many of the experts, I do think that at this point, for anyone paying attention to the data, continuing to fear the coronavirus to the extent that we are locking down economies is irrational. And, well, you may be saying to yourself, but Lewis, why not just take the precautions? Better safe than sorry, right? Even if only a few lives are saved by the lockdowns. I mean, those are lives saved. But that's because you don't think about the lives cost. Now, in places like America and other first world countries, this generally is going to mean suicides. People who lose their jobs and are potentially unable to provide for their families, who simply cannot take it anymore. There have been quite a few cases of this recorded already, and the suicide rate for this year I'm expecting to be much higher than other years. Now, that is my own projection. I could be wrong, who knows? But more immediately, we are also seeing cases of starvation in many other countries. So you look outside the first world, and all of a sudden, shutting down a third of the economy means that people can't get food. Shutting down meat factories in America means that, you can't get a burger from Wendy's. You have to go and get one from the storage in the store. But shutting down meat factories in Ethiopia, if there are any meat factories in Ethiopia, is going to lead to people dying. Now, it's going to be pretty much impossible to tell, I think, whether or not more people are killed by the lockdown than are saved. There's just no way for us to know exactly how many people we can save, but there are some ways that we can estimate this. Say, for instance, that every single person in the world got COVID-19 at the 0.02 death toll. And even though that death toll is affected by people who, have pre-existing conditions, let's just apply it evenly across the board to the whole world. And I don't know. I don't know how many people are going to die by starvation because of this situation. But just like the number of people who have been inflating the death toll numbers of COVID in hospitals, the number is above zero. So why are people so willing to go along with these authoritarian, nightmarish lockdowns that are going so far beyond the laws of so many countries, beyond, in fact, the Constitution of America, the very First Amendment being infringed and outright denied in New York and other places? Why are people more willing to face this lockdown than to face this virus? Well, it's because our biggest fears are the fear of the unknown. And when we started putting these lockdowns in place, a lot wasn't known about the virus. It's not really fair to say that, the lockdowns weren't a good idea at the time when we didn't know the death toll. Or is it? I mean, we've faced situations like this in the past. Basically every decade a new pandemic comes along, sometimes even faster, and we don't know a lot about how it's going to spread or affect or kill people. Take some precautions and see where it goes from there while we continue our studies on it. What we haven't done in the past is completely locked down our economies, which is going to give us a good example of the real damage that can do. So hopefully we'll see this and never, ever do it again. However, I think the reason why this happened is because as population increases, the number affected by any given thing that affects humans gets bigger. So all of a sudden it could mean millions dead instead of tens of thousands of dead with, a virus like the first SARS, where the expectations were much, much lower, but really so is the population at the time. So the numbers sound scarier and scarier the more of us that there are. At the same time, the death toll for the lockdown, for suicides and starvation, that's something that's much more quasi. It's ethereal. If you're someone who's never suffered from suicide or depression and live in a Western country where you're probably going to have access to food throughout the lockdown, it is kind of hard to picture these as being real problems because they're not going to affect you. But it's not hard for anyone to picture their lungs filling up with liquid to the point where even a ventilator shoved down their throat can't keep enough air pumped in to keep them alive. It's visceral. We can all feel it. We can picture it. And when we hear it described that this goes through a nursing home and that, a couple dozen grandmothers and grandfathers are dying on ventilators because of this horrible virus, well, it's easy to get yourself worked up. It's a lot harder to think about the people who are affected by this in very, very substantial but less direct ways. And I think that their lives matter just as much as the lives of the sick and elderly. So, what should we have done? Because I think, looking back, hindsight is perfect, I think we can mostly agree that a lot of these lockdowns were bad ideas. That the amount we cut our economies is going to be more harm than help. And that letting our constitutions, laws, and basic rights and freedoms be infringed over something that ultimately wasn't that big of a deal is going to have lasting consequences if we're not very, very careful to make it clear to our governments that this is not something we're going to lay down and take again. This is a mistake that we need to learn from. So how do we avoid situations like this in the future? How do we avoid picturing our lungs filling up with that liquid and stop and take a moment to think about the effects that our lockdowns are going to have on other people? Because with this lockdown, you think, sure, you save yourself. In the Western world, you're going to be fine if you lock down. And you might save some lives there. Oh, sure, cutting the supply chains might cause starvation in other countries, but that's somewhere else. That's hard to think about. And there are people dying right next to you on ventilators if you live in New York. Because honestly, most of the rest of the country, you probably don't know someone who has been hospitalized with the disease. So you can save yourself with these lockdowns. It does give you that protection, but at the cost of others, at the cost of the people who do lose their jobs, who lose supply chains to the point that there isn't food in the stores. And, places like Venezuela that were starving before the lockdowns and the supply chains started getting cut up. And people are going to get desperate, people are going to die, and it's horrible. Picture yourself in the woods with 2 kids that you're taking care of, and a bear comes up and roars at you. What do? Do you run and save yourself? Because you can outrun those kids. And if the bear attacks, it'll probably attack one, maybe both of them, but you're going to get away. Or do you tell the kids to back away, stand up, and roar right back in that bear's face? Because if you as a group run from the bear, its chase instinct very well may activate, and it's likely to chase one of you down and maul you. But bears, for the most part, aren't going to stand up in a fight. Bears will run from cats if they get surprised from them, and they say the best thing you can do is make yourself big and, loud for a reason, because for the most part, the bear is going to back down. So in situation 1, you probably save yourself, but someone's going to get hurt in all likelihood. And, it may not be you, so that may be abstract, but it's perfectly avoidable if, rather than running from your fear, you stand and face it. Let's go back to the quote that I started this segment with, shall we? And there's a little bit more to it, excuse me, that I didn't get to in the beginning. So this time, I think I'll finish it. I must not fear, for fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I must face my fear. I must let it pass over me and through me. And when the fear is gone, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has been, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. When you're afraid of something, when you're terrified of something, you have three basic options. You can run from it, ignore it, try and pretend it doesn't exist, which is just going to make you more afraid. Because every time you think of whatever it is that scared you, realizing that you're hiding from it, that it's had the effect that you can't face it, that's just going to terrify you more. You can let your fear control your response. You can act in fear, do what you think will make you feel the most safe, which is what we've done in this coronavirus situation with the lockdowns and the authoritarian nightmare that it has become. We've let our fear control us, and we have reacted rather than taking time to think and act. Or you can face your fear. You can address to yourself why it is you're afraid. You can take time to look into those details and see if they're rational or irrational. And if it's an unknown, the scariest things of all, if you simply do not have the information to know whether or not you should be afraid, then even if you are afraid, take time to wait for that information to come in before acting in fear. Look for the data and learn. Come at things from a perspective of knowledge. Because acting before we had all of the information, acting out of fear before we could possibly know what actions were the right ones to take, is what's led to a third of the economy shutting down, in America at least, and the highest unemployment rates our country has ever seen, with a similar story across the globe. But hey, that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I think I'm going to go ahead and do several videos on fear, its effects on society, and how it can be avoided, because I think it is an incredibly important subject. I had a PS, but it is eluding my brain for right now, so maybe I'll include it in the next video. On that note, I think I'll let you all go. Thanks for watching the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. I'm your host, Cypher. Have a wonderful night, everyone.